Since the introduction of the Deep Dark in 2022, and later the Pale Garden in 2024, it seems that Mojang has been on a streak of adding new horror locations. But with both of these new biomes, there's still some content left to be desired, which raises the question, what's next for Minecraft's horror biomes? But before we talk about that, I want to go over the limitations I'll be putting on myself for these ideas. First of all, nothing adjacent to that of standard Minecraft horror mods. And what I mean by this is no new crazy enemies that can run up to the player and kill them in one hit. And the horror cannot be reliant on loud and obnoxious jump scare sounds, but rather only environmental and atmospheric tensions, because as much as I love messing around with horror mods, there's only so many times a player can be cheaply scared, especially when it's expected. Additionally, no new features that overshadow the pre-existing danger of each biome, but rather only things that can build off of it. For example, making a super warden that spawns automatically when the player enters the Deep Dark, can kill a player instantly, plays a really loud jump scare sound, and has more health and does more damage than the original warden, would go against every single one of these conditions, as it is not only able to instantly kill a player, but can do so in an almost unavoidable way, is extremely obnoxious, and overshadows the regular warden due to its stronger attributes. Now, with those guidelines out of the way, we can start introducing new features, starting with the Ancient City. Now, the first idea that came to mind when enhancing the Deep Dark are these new containers, with those being the Echo Vases. These pots were initially shown off in some 2021 concept art, and would be very easy to find, with them being littered all around ancient cities, and serving as a sort of risk and reward, as inside would be guaranteed loot, but breaking the pots would release a giant sound wave, which would set off any Sculk sensors and shriekers in a nearby range. These pots would add a huge new gameplay element to think about when raiding an ancient city, and I think it'd be very interesting to see. Similar to the Echo Vases would be the new Deepslate chests, which again would serve as another way to obtain loot in the ancient cities. The way these Deepslate chests would work would be by slowly being opened after being clicked on multiple times, and giving the player a short window of time to grab as much loot as possible before it slams shut, creating a sound that would alert Sculk sensors. It would kind of work similarly to brushing, where if the player stops brushing a suspicious block, the item retracts inside after a few seconds. Additionally, improving the loot would be a very helpful change, as currently the loot in ancient cities can be super repetitive, and it feels like the items you get are the same couple of enchanted leggings and hose, which is understandable due to the main gimmicks of the structure, with those being the Swift Sneak enchantment going on pants, as well as being able to break Sculk with hose, but at the same time creating some variety in armor types as well as the tools the player could get in chests would be a very nice touch. Now, moving back to the actual horror of the biome, since we don't want to add another mob as to not detract from the experience of encountering the warden, but rather enhance it, which we'll do through the addition of the new Sculk Jaw. The Sculk Jaw would be a new block which would trap any mob that walks over it, with the exclusion of the warden, dealing decent damage and stunning any entity unlucky enough to stand on top of the jaw. As a bonus, the jaw can be mined with Silk Touch and moved out of the Deep Dark to serve as a sort of utility block, as it could act in a way similar to a composter and be able to convert mob drops into varying amounts of experience, with the rarity of the item determining how much experience the player would receive. Anyways, circling back to the loot in the structure, I believe that one of the main items the player can get from ancient cities are lacking a lot of functionality, with that being Echo Shards, with them having a singular crafting recipe, the Recovery Compass. Now, I actually mentioned this exact point in my resource rework video, and while I like the ideas I came up with, I want to have some new ideas. Maybe by having Echo Shards be applied to a tool or piece of armor, they could be kept in a player's inventory after dying, to a limit of 1 death. This would be super useful for players trying to re-gear after dying, however, it would have one of the same issues as the Recovery Compass, with that being its uselessness to hardcore players, as it would have no effect on their gameplay at all. Maybe this could be countered by adding other uses, such as a way to extract experience from Sculk. Or maybe an Echo Spyglass, which would have the same recipe as a Spyglass, but with the Amethyst Crystal replaced with an Echo Shard, allowing for players to have night vision applied whenever they look through their Spyglass. This, while technically being able to be outweighed by client-side mods like Fulbright, would give players another tool to help find ores in caves, and would generally be a good upgrade to a pre-existing tool. Additionally, I would love if Echo Shards could be applied to armor trims, as it would give even more options for customizability through armor trims. Now, the last thing I think the Ancient City would benefit from is maybe having maps sold to the player from Master Cartographer villagers, as they would help players who don't know how to find ancient cities locate them without making them too easy to find or have players be reliant on outside sources to find them. And with that, I think we have enough features to warrant an upgrade to the ancient cities. But what about the Pale Garden? Well, before we talk about this, I need to plug for subscribers. See, making these videos takes a lot of effort, so I would really appreciate it if you'd like the video, subscribe because I'll be making a Discord when I hit 5,000 subscribers, and maybe even hit the weird little hype channel button if you're on mobile. Anyways, with that out of the way, let's see what we could add to the Pale Garden. Starting with a new structure, with that being the Pale Crypt. The crypt would be a pretty rare structure which would generate in the Pale Oak Forest, having graves made with suspicious gravel blocks to brush, with the loot in those usually being resin, iron, and a couple of mixed mob drops and pale foliage. However, inside of the crypt, the structure would be a bit more maze-like, with 4 creaking hearts in the center of the room to act as some sort of threat, as well as a few more scattered throughout the structure. Now, as well as being able to find a lot of resin, mob loot, and pale plants, the player would be able to get a new enchantment from this structure, with that being Foresight. Now, what would this enchantment do? Well, Foresight would be a helmet enchantment found only in the Pale Crypt, allowing for players to have a longer peripheral range when looking at creakings, which would allow them to manage multiple of them with significantly more ease. This enchantment would also have a similar functionality to wearing a pumpkin, and allow players to temporarily look at Enderman, but maybe only for a short period of time before the enchantment stops working. Now, I mentioned that the crypt would have resin as one of the main loot items, but similarly to Echo Shards, there's currently very few uses for resin aside from building blocks and creaking hearts, and I think that they could use an upgrade. A cool feature I thought of would maybe be being able to freeze crops in whatever state they're in by right-clicking on them. This would be a super helpful building tool, especially for players who like making more intricate details, and would be relatively realistic, as resin in real life can be used to preserve plants and small insects. I've also had the idea for an eyesight detector before, and I think it would be a very useful redstone component, and would give another use to resin. And finally, the last idea I had for the Pale Garden would be introducing new mob variants for the normal enemies, such as the Pale Creeper, with it being called the Creaker or something along those lines, and functioning as a mix of the Creaking and the Creeper, with it only being able to approach when the player isn't making direct eye contact, but still exploding when too close, and serving as a real threat to the player while still fitting the biome's theme. This would also make for a very cool zombie variant, maybe called the Petrified, with them essentially just being a zombie with the drawbacks of the creaking, although to compensate, maybe it could give an effect that makes the player take damage while making eye contact with any entity, with it being called Ometophobia. It would also be very interesting if the player could make potions of Ometophobia by using either eye blossoms or resin. I know I mentioned new mobs being strange to add in the intro of this video, but seeing as we've received so many new mob variants with the recent Mounts of Mayhem drop, I think these would be amazing fits for new threats for the Pale Garden, although I can understand if it's not the route Mojang would take. With all of that said, however, that's everything I could think of for the Pale Garden. But that's not everything in mind for the video, as given Mojang's recent interest with horror locations, I wouldn't be surprised if we received more of these types of biomes, and I even came up with 3 small concepts for what some of these could be. The first one of these is definitely the most anticipated of the 3, with that being a Sculk dimension. A lot of players have made speculations about the ancient city centerpiece, and considering other similarly shaped structures are referred to as portals in the game files, it had people curious as to where it might lead, and I feel as if Mojang would do something along those lines, possibly bringing in some new Sculk mobs and blocks based on their old concept art. Another idea would be some kind of nether horror biome, as it's already one of the most dangerous locations in the game, and having a horror biome there could help build fear off of the pre-existing dangers. Maybe some kind of pumice biome, having little specters who attack in numbers, and the biome's reward being something to aid with building in the nether. Maybe something that works like a sponge on lava, and giving players an incentive to visit. My last concept for one of these biomes is heavily inspired by thalassophobia, or the fear of the ocean, with the location being found deep underwater and being guarded by a giant leviathan. Alex's Caves actually has an amazing interpretation of this idea, and I was actually convinced we might receive a biome similar to this when Mojang started teasing the Nautilus. And that's all of my ideas. I'm a huge fan of both of the horror biomes that we already have, and to answer the question I asked at the start of the video, I don't know. Mojang seems to have a very clear vision as to what they want to do with these locations, and I personally believe that if they made drops to either add new content like this, or visit the pre-existing biomes with a fresh coat of paint, it would be very interesting. And even if this isn't something Mojang might do, it's always fun to speculate, and these were just my ideas for that. But those are just my ideas, and let me know if you have any others in the comments. I'd love to see them. Anyways, bye bye, subscribe, bye bye.